Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Place. I'm the director of the CGIR Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, or PIM for short. And I'm very excited to welcome you to this PIM webinar on the investment effects of forest rights devolution, how community tenure is facilitating investment in the commons for inclusive growth. This work is part of the PIM portfolio under our research flagship 5 on governance of natural resources. And our speaker today is Dr. Stephen Lowry. He's Senior Associate in the Equity, Gender, and Tenure Research Program at the Center for International Forestry Research, or CIFOR. And I've known Steve for more than 25 years, and I have to say in those 25 years, he's had quite an illustrious career. And so bear with me as I give you a brief background on Steve. So Stephen has published studies and scholarly articles on the social, economic, and ecological effects of forest rights devolution, the impacts of land rights formalization on agricultural investment and productivity, and tenure factors affecting adoption of forest landscape restoration practices in Africa, among other topics. Steve received a PhD from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1988. And since then, he's had many different positions, and I'll briefly mention some of those. He held senior positions in the Ford Foundation, including assistant representative for the Foundation's Office for South Africa and Namibia, and regional representative for the Foundation's Office for the Middle East and North Africa in the 1990s and early 2000s. He was also president of Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. He was a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations. He headed a USAID-funded program in South Sudan and based in Juba, assisting the government there to develop a national land policy. He also served as global practice leader for land tenure and property rights at DAI, a Washington-based consulting group. Following that, he joined the CGIR. He joined CIFOR in 2014 as research director of CIFOR's Forests and Governance Program, and then subsequently as director of the Equity, Gender, and Tenure Research Program. From starting in November, he relocated here in Washington, also still holding those positions, to join us here closer with PIM, where we're happy to host him for several years. And he helped co-lead our flagship on governance of natural resources. And so with that, we're very happy to welcome him to the webinar and hear his thoughts and about his, many of the research that he's done with CIFOR and with PIM over the last few years. And before I hand it over to Steve, let me remind everyone how we proceed on our webinars. So Stephen will begin shortly with a presentation that you will see on your screens, and it will last for about 30 minutes. During the presentation, we invite all of you listeners to send in questions via the chat window on the right side of your screens. We collate the questions and group any that are similar in content before posing them to Stephen, and he will then answer the questions as we pose them to him. And we handle it this way to make the best use of our 1 hour together. So we also are recording the webinar, and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event. So with that, now I'll hand it over to Stephen. Let's go ahead, please.
Thanks, Frank, for the wonderful introduction. And I just want to start by providing a little context to this work that I'm presenting today, that we're discussing today. And many of you who worked on questions of the commons and the management of the commons will be mindful that much of the research over the sort of last 20 to 25 years has focused on the question of rights devolution. Both natural resources, particularly forests in the global south and elsewhere, is pretty much owned by the state. And so there's been this quite active program, really partly a social movement, partly research that's been considering questions of really the benefits of devolving rights, potential benefits of devolving rights to the local level. And some of those benefits that are anticipated or argued about include, well, the outcomes might be better. There'll be better forest cover, more sustainable management of natural resources, forests, fisheries, pasture land. When people who live and work close to the the ground, if you will, have a chance to apply their knowledge, experience, and judgment in coordinating their actions and in ways that improve resource management, and sort of logically in ways that are more efficient and effective than centrally controlled governance. So, but the focus has been on advocacy and the debates around will the outcomes be better environmentally and socially. Now we're in a position, and this is what the research looks at, to consider, in the light of successful efforts to devolve rights in many countries, including some of the countries that we're going to consider here today, there's been success in devolving rights, really beginning in some of the countries here in the early 90s, late 90s, and in every case we'll be talking about today, it's been several years since rights were actually devolved to communities. And so now we're looking at questions around, well, what happened? And specifically with respect to the investment effects. What kinds of investments have, if any, okay, it's a hypothetical question, have resulted from the rights devolution? Have the kinds of benefits with respect to environmental outcomes, investment, livelihood development, better incomes been realized? And so that's at the heart. That was the major motive for this research. This research, as Frank mentioned, is part of a body of work that's been supported by PIM over the last few years that has looked at, in various ways, the investment effects of rights devolution. A number of products have been produced, including a couple that we'll point out to you at the end of the webinar. We have a guide, for instance, on investing in commonly held resources. And much of the presentation today is based on a journal article in Press entitled, "Is Community Tenure Facilitating Investment in Community Held Resources for Inclusive Development?" So that's really the context that I wanted to share with you. So what about investment? Why is investment important? I think some of these points are pretty obvious. Significant funding is needed to meet the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Reducing global environmental degradation and mitigating climate change requires significant private capital. We think often principally of public investment, but changes in how businesses do their business in relation to their footprint or impacts on the environment are very important considerations. Business as usual is not going to be acceptable for much longer. And private enterprises, from small firms to large corporations, must make fundamental changes in agricultural, forestry, and land use practices if the agricultural, forestry, and land use sector is going to contribute to holding the global temperature increase 1.5 degrees centigrade. Being mindful, for instance, that forests represent about 20% of forest lost or land use related, climate carbon losses represent about 20% of the climate budget with respect to release of carbon into the atmosphere. And the restorative potential, the climate mitigation potential for forestry, particularly, is quite considerable. So alongside restructuring of land use practices, there's technological innovation, regulatory reforms, and improved supply chain management will be required. And that's the whole question of supply chain management with respect to pursuing climate goals is quite an important topic, one with what I won't speak to today. So here in sum, importantly, however, there are large barriers to investment in sustainable use of natural resources in developing countries, and maybe especially in contexts where natural resources such as forests, pasture land, and fisheries are held and used in common. So here I want to speak a little bit about those perceived, let's say commonly or really popularly perceived barriers. Some of them have real validity, and they're in many cases widely accepted, and as such can represent sort of can lead investors, particularly in the private sector, to be quite cautious about when they consider the prospects of investing in contexts where people hold resources commonly. So number one is commonly held resources are not subject to sale or purchase. This is quite a long-standing sort of principle in economics, and that where an investor can't hold collateral, then that's an issue, and that could impede investment. There have been some remedies to the collateral problem in many contexts, including with respect to getting finance to poor people. As many of you know, microfinance models typically don't require collateral as a condition. There are other ways of securing that loan. There's been progress in this field, but still it's a factor when you're looking at potentially large-scale investments in natural resources. Then the second point is the varying aims of right holders within a commons can complicate achievement of consensus about investment goals. And so, communities are not homogeneous. Typically, they're quite heterogeneous. There's divisions in wealth, expectations, livelihood goals. There could be divisions along ethnic and caste lines, and including in some of the countries that we'll consider here today. And so reaching consensus and agreement is a very typical sort of issue with respect to governing common pool resources, and a lot of work has been done on that question, as many of you will be aware of. And then there's this sort of developmental question, point 3, that community institutions may lack the capacity, protocols, and experience to negotiate and manage investment partnerships and commercial enterprises. This is sort of to be expected. This is sort of the classic capacity development challenge, and a lot of organizations and governments have experience in addressing it. But importantly, and this is sort of an opportunity, this fourth point, it may be seen by, on the one hand, as a constraint, as a barrier, but if we sort of wrestle with this last issue that's noted here, then we can realize some potential breakthroughs, I think. And this is that the social character of commons ownership requires that benefits be shared across the entire community of right holders. This is a very important point, often in the form of investments in infrastructure, education, and employment opportunities. And so this may be obvious at the local level that, okay, here's a common pool resource. We as community members own that resource collectively. And as individual right holders, we are entitled to a certain amount of income and benefit from that may accrue from this resource. So this is understood locally, but it's often not understood by outside investors. And so understanding the potential implications of working with organizations representing a community or a collective of right holders is a challenge. And in fact, our guide to investing in the commons, which we'll be sharing with you, speaks very directly to this question of collective ownership and collective benefit. Okay. So here in looking at the literature, once again, I noted this sort of draft journal article. We sort of cited 4 key conditions that, when present, can reduce risks. Of course, we know that investment is very much about risk on the one hand, assurance on the other. Assurance that steps have been taken to mitigate risk in ways that will enable the flow of investment funding. So there are 4 conditions that, when present, can reduce risk and provide investors with the assurances they need to invest in community forest institutions. I just want to pause here. What do we mean by community forest institutions? For us, it's a bit of an umbrella term that speaks to the variety of institutions at the local level, typically, that are involved in managing, governing, and investing as business enterprises in the commonly used resource. So by way of example, they would include in Nepal, one of the countries we'll speak about, community forest user groups, okay, which are the right holders. Okay, the user group is the right holder. We'll have a governing and governance structure and leadership with that structure, that organization. Its roles and powers often stipulated or backed up by law. Okay, there'll be, and that community forest user group, in fact, can form itself into a business enterprise. So it becomes, at the same time, a community forest enterprise. Okay, so we're interested in in how they operate and function as entities that generate financial benefit through utilization, and often through in the context of partnerships with outside investors. So they can simultaneously be community forest enterprises. Then there can be community forest enterprises that are outside entities and that are more traditional businesses that are in partnership with community forest user groups. So anyway, it can represent sort of different kinds of formations of organization and enterprises that are organizations that we look at in our work. So number one here is, among the 4 key conditions are the presence of clear, secure, and sufficiently broad rights. And we know that this is the key idea here, that what's happened, a condition is rights to evolution. Are those rights sufficiently robust, secure, and so on? And we find that they are not always sufficiently robust, or local people can't really exercise them, or they're diminished or compromised in some ways. And that's something that investors and communities and advocates need to be aware of. And we'll offer a few examples of that in the course of the presentation. The relations of trust and strong social networks within communities and between communities and external actors is vital. And we find that in the early days of post-evolution, as people are looking for, come to understand locally that outside investment, technology, and management skills can help them generate more income in a sustainable fashion from their resource. There's also a certain amount of, there's a lack of familiarity with the private sector generally, and a certain amount of suspicion with respect to the goals and behavior. It's a trust issue. On the other hand, private sector investors are unfamiliar with local communities and how to negotiate and how to work with them. And in sort of a typical business relationship, they both have different expectations of what a fair deal looks like. Okay, community members may expect, hey, this is our resource now. We should realize higher benefit than what these people are offering. And on the other side, the business may say, well, the community doesn't understand the costs that we're bearing to make this happen. So these are typical. You find this in lots of relationships, but in situations where there's lack of experience on both parties in dealing, working, negotiating deals in these particular contexts of collective ownership, then we find that intermediaries can be very, very important in explaining each side one to the other. That's something we can talk more about. Number 3, clear and enforceable rules and procedures governing the use and management of forests and associated enterprises. Sort of stands to reason. I'm not going to say anything more about it at this point. And then sufficient technological negotiation and management capacity within the community. And that's really something I was just speaking to a moment ago. That capacity is vital, and this has been a target of investment by donors and NGOs in building that capacity. So our research looked at the experience of what happens, of investment in commonly held resources post-rights reform in 4 countries. Guatemala, it's the case of the Mayan Bassa Reserve Community Forest Concessions. Mexico, the ejidos and indigenous communities. I should say about 60% of all forests in Mexico are under the control of ejidos, which are collective ownership models. Nepal, the community forest user groups. There are about 20,000 community forest user groups in Nepal, managing about 40 to 45% of the country's national forestry estate. And then Namibia, which we're really looking at here, the community wildlife concessions, not forests, but wildlife ownership. In our presentation today, I'm focusing on Guatemala and Nepal, really in the interest of time. They all have common sort of experience, and it's relevant to, it gets into our summary, all 4 countries. They all have differences that are interesting. But today I'll be focusing on the Guatemala and Nepal cases. And here's our methods: review of scholarly and grade literature, collation of information from fieldwork visits, We spent a lot of time, especially in Nepal and Guatemala, as it's turned out, workshops, observation, reviews, and document analysis. And then financial data, which we find often very hard still to get to, but we've been able to look into financial reports from donors, annual reports of user groups. And so this slide just really illustrates the point that there's been this process of rights devolution in the forest sector. And we see on the right-hand side these sort of tenure types that tend to represent a greater or larger bundle of rights. You see on the far right, it's collective title to land and forests, which we see increasingly in Latin America, particularly extended to indigenous communities. Rights devolved to community user groups, which would represent the sort of default case, and community concessions, long-term leases, which in fact represents the Guatemala case. We see here that overall, comparing Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that processes of rights devolution tend to be more advanced, if you will, more rights as a generalization. This movement is stronger in Latin America. But Asia, and on a sort of selected country basis, there's been some significant progress. There's been limited progress in Africa, arguably with respect to certainly the range of rights that we're seeing devolved in Latin America and Asia. And this chart represents that sort of phenomena, that comparison. So here I want to talk about really a key point is the importance, and I guess I can't emphasize it enough, maybe I'm overemphasizing it, but there needs to be a strong commitment by the state to rights devolution. And that needs to be backed up by not only statements of policy, but statements, but meaningful legal reforms and development of the regulatory framework to ensure that those rights are effectively devolved, and the regulations would also state, for instance, what the devolving rights to communities implies for the rights of the residual rights of the state. Once again, in property rights, no one party holds all the rights. The state, the public has an interest, for instance, that land and resources will be used sustainably or will not be used in ways that degrade the environment or pollute the environment. That ensuring that outcome is a state role. But the whole kind of legal regime with respect to property rights governance needs to be redefined, community in relation to state. And that in and of itself requires significant investment in public policy and legal reform. And so here's, in each of the 4 countries, and this is the Guatemala case, is a little bit exceptional because it was linked to a peace process, and it was not involved in a law that affects forest use and management in the entire country, but in a particular area, and where they've applied a particular tenure model, which in this case is the community forest concession. So, and that really developed out of this process that began in 1985, creating the protected area system. 1990, the Mine Biosphere Reserve was established. And then it was agreed by 96 that 100,000 hectares would be set aside within, really at the core of the Mine Biosphere Reserve as forest land for communities, where 12 community forest concessions of about 10 to 12,000 hectares each, quite significant land areas, were granted to communities as a 25-year lease right. So you think of sort of a traditional timber concession of 20,000 hectares, 10,000 hectares for timber production. This is an analogous model, a quite familiar model, where the leaseholder, the right holder, is a community. And I think that's a very innovative approach, and other countries in Latin America especially have been looking at this model. And it's overall proved quite successful. I'll just say very importantly that there are conditions associated with the lease. And among those conditions were that each community concession a secure Forest Stewardship Council certification of a management plan for the forest within 3 years of the granting of the lease. And this is a condition for retaining the lease. And the results have been quite positive with respect to the outcomes. So here, I want to talk a little bit in this slide. Sorry for all the words, but the basic notion here, the key theme is that investment comes in various forms. It comes from private sector, the public sector through donors and the governments, and it comes from inward investment by the community forest institutions themselves. And then, of course, NGOs have been key in this. And so this gives you a sense of the kinds of investments that have been made, and they're quite significant. If you can all take that in, I don't really want to give you a minute to kind of digest this. But you see, for instance, looking at the role of NGOs over on the right-hand side, donors, this is typically donor funding, but much of these funds go into training programs that develop forest management skills, the forest management plans, then the FSC certification. That was actually can be an expensive process. It could cost $10,000 or more, given the scale of the holding. And then as the community moves into sort of business enterprises, which have been very, very successful, often based on marketing of sustainably harvest mahogany and cedar to the North American market, a number of non-timber forest products that are going to the sort of the floral industry in North America. These supply chains, these business partnerships and relationships, there's been investment in developing those. Now, looking at the middle column, community forestry institutions, a lot of the funding that has been, a lot of the income that's been generated from these enterprises have gone into health and education investment locally, significant job generation. We'll look at some of those outcomes in the next slide. And then the last point here in the center is the importance of what we characterize as a secondary level institution, which affiliates all of the concessions and represents them in negotiations with the public and private sectors. And in this case, it's the ACOFOP, which is the Community Forest Association of Bataan. And they, for instance, have been key in enabling 9 of the communities establish a shared timber mill that's been established near Flores in Bataan that is processing the high-value timber that's been coming out of now, here's some of the investment outcomes in Guatemala. The deforestation rates are equivalent. In fact, they're better in some recent studies than the state-managed protected areas that surround them. So there's, the deforestation rate is about 0.5% a year, which compared to the national rate of 1.5 is quite low. That there's also wildlife populations have not been affected by community logging and concessions, which is important. So there's kind of a impact on wildlife and the natural environment, but biodiversity specifically has not been negative. Here's some data on the number of daily jobs generated. There's significant job sharing among community members. All of them have really a sense of entitlement, which is respected, to have some kind of a job in one or more of the enterprises. And if that job isn't full-time, if it means that people will share parts of a full-time job, then there's agreement typically on that. So someone would work 2 days a week, others would work 1 day a week, others would work 2 days a week, and so on and so forth. So we see data here that on increases in household income, and that among some of the enterprises, household income based on forest enterprises have ranged from 19%. total income. And that I made note here previously of the community forest enterprises capitalized a shared timber mill that has created jobs and diversified livelihood opportunities. So there have been significant benefits. The key issue, policy issue facing Guatemala, facing the concessions is the 25-year leases are coming up for renewal. And so there's debate within the country about, well, should those be renewed? Or are there other uses that they might be sort of better suited for? And the case has been, I think, many scholars and researchers believe has been made that this has been a successful model and that the environmental as well as the social outcomes have been quite positive. But that debate and discussion is underway. Now, looking at Nepal, similarly, it's actually different from Guatemala. There's been a national effort that really was born in the late 1970s in response to significant local activism and international advocacy that something needed to be done with respect to the condition of Nepal's forest estate. There are very high rates of deforestation. The hill zone, Himalayan hills were becoming widely degraded, significant loss of topsoil, degradation of water systems, and negative impacts on agriculture and livelihoods. And so there was advocacy around the notion of community rights, community-based forestry, where communities held stronger and clearer rights. This is really coincident with the whole common property movement that we are familiar with globally and in the literature. So there was a decentralization in 1982 through the Decentralization Act. There was the effort to transfer rights gained sort of momentum in the late 80s, and then a new multi-party parliamentary system in the early 90s strongly supports the rights devolution agenda. In spending time in Nepal, I've been there sort of 8 times in the last 3.5 or 4 years, what is very evident is the centrality of forest policy to national politics. It's the importance of forests as a source of income, but also as key to the country's environmental agenda and responsibilities is quite a strong focus of debate. It's also a sector where there's fairly significant public sector employment is linked, and so there's a lot of public interest in that. Well, and so we see in 95, 96 that there was, initially the focus in Nepal was not rights devolution for livelihoods, but rights devolution for better forest conservation outcomes. But in the 90s, there became recognition that, well, we needed to enable people to make a living from sustainable forest management, and so there was enabling legislation that allowed the community user groups to start engaging in commercial partnerships and commercial forestry activities. So here's a similar slide, the range of investments by different sectors, and I suppose the point here is that many sectors have to be involved in this process, and they have to be in alignment. So once again, if the law is not supportive of the process, then very little is going to happen. If the regulators are not understanding of the kind of requirements of a social enterprise and private enterprise with respect to utilizing the resources in a sustainable way, or overburden the enterprises in ways that reduce investment and reduce utilization and ultimately incomes, then that's a problem as well. So everyone needs to be in alignment, and we're developing this notion of really a social innovation system. We tend to focus on one element in the sort of architecture here, the community and what they need. But over the long term, every party needs to realign or think about what they need to do to ensure the community investment and forestry management model is successful. That can't be business as usual for any of the parties. It's sort of very interesting to think through the implications for each of the parties in the context of a rights devolution. It's just not a matter of transferring rights to the community and then continuing to operate as if, well, things haven't changed fundamentally, because they have. And this is maybe particularly relevant to the roles of the state in its regulatory role. So here are some of the outcomes in Nepal. There's been very positive outcomes with respect to forest cover. That there are actually now 20,000 registered community forest user groups. Not all of them, in fact, a minority of them are engaged in commercially related activities, but there's been significant revenue generated from forest-based activities based on this 2013 study. And then there are divisions that wealthier households are more likely to benefit from investments in private and public goods, as well as poorest households are likely to benefit from investments in common goods only. The law provides that so-called lower castes are entitled to 35% of all revenue generated by community forest user group activities. And this is generally observed in terms of regulation. And that's an example of a positive regulation, a regulation with positive effect that is part of the law in the context of a society where there's systemic divisions and wealth and power. And then here the group that's equivalent to ACOFOP in Guatemala is called FICOFUN. It's become a very important advocacy group for community on behalf of the 20,000 community forest enterprises, and have advocated for important subsequent reforms to law that have enabled investment at the community level. These include some of the laws that are highlighted here, including the 2017 Industrial Enterprises Act, which makes it easier and less costly to establish small enterprises. But here, I want to move a little bit quickly here because I think, just being mindful of time, we sort of constructed a theory of change linking rights devolution to financial investments, environmental and social outcomes. And it is in sort of three phases. And the point here is that investment readiness, a term that we use, is something that takes place in phases and over time. Okay, and so the first phase here really is a set of investments that on the right hand, the blue colored text responds to some of these contextual issues and the barriers that we've spoken about. And so this is the rights devolution and community forest institutional formation element, which is phase one: recognition of community rights, forest award and registration of title and certificate, formation of community institutions to receive title, demarcation of community boundaries. That's the first step. The second step is investment in administrative and management capacity building. The key investors, it's really the donors, government, NGOs, community forest institutions. Then here's the range and the center of investments in building forest, natural resource governance, capacity, and so on and so forth. Community management plans, administrative, financial negotiation, and business skills, and then the formation of these secondary level institutions and organizations like ACOFOP and FACOFUN, which we found in every case, in every country context that we looked at. And then this has the effect, we see, of changes in perceptions of risk tolerance. Tenure is perceived as secure, rules exist, are broadly understood, increased confidence that agreements will be kept, increased ability to negotiate effectively with external actors. These outcomes are the response the response to investments. So, successful government, NGOs, communities need to be mindful that significant investment is necessary to achieve these changes in perceptions of risk and assurance that create context favorable to investment, inward investment and external investment. Then here we see the manifestations of investment that's a result of these investments in institutions, basically. And so we see various investments in the capacities related to doing business and managing and producing timber and other products from the forests. And ultimately, we see positive environmental, social, and financial returns, enhanced forest conditions, increasing livelihoods, political empowerment, and financial viability. So just summing, so this, sorry, this slide ties it all together, and you can have a chance to, you'll see it, so there's interrelations if you want to look closer later on. So summing up, so in the cases that we considered, devolution of rights to communities has catalyzed investment in collectively held forests and other natural resources. Rights recognition and devolution is a catalyst for investment that for the most part would otherwise not have happened in the absence of rights devolution. Investment readiness is a process of internal and external social and economic development that unfolds through stages. Emergence of legitimate community-level governance organizations is an important precondition to attracting and retaining investor interest. Investors need someone, an entity to negotiate with that has standing and legitimacy. Community forest enterprises really should be seen as social enterprises, and this has become clearer as we've gotten sort of looked more closely at the character of the enterprises that are operating. This is where resources are collectively held. All grant holders, all right holders benefit from investment, and significant revenue generated is invested in public goods. On balance, a greater proportion of the revenue generation goes into roads, health, and education. By virtue of decisions by the community, they want to see those monies go back into generating collective benefits. In one concession in Guatemala, for instance, the money was going into a scholarship fund to send local children to high schools outside of the area because there wasn't good secondary education in the area. These are scholarships that were being paid for by revenues from timber and other activities. But we've also seen gains in local income, and the strengthening of collective tenure has been shown to lead directly to household level investment in housing, education, and health. Just by virtue of recognizing the rights, people at the household level use more of their own savings to invest in their housing because there's also a general sense of security that arises with respect to domestic investment. We've been talking about investment in natural resources, but there's a sense of security with respect to we're here, we're recognized, we can invest in housing. Forest cover has improved in Guatemala and Nepal, and wildlife in Namibia seeing tremendous increases in wildlife numbers in the range of wildlife. Then successful outcomes, once again, are more likely where the roles of community, state, and market are seen by all parties as linked to systems of social innovation. Everyone needs to rethink, reconsider what they need to do in terms of their own institutional arrangements, how staff are trained, what kinds of skills are valued in supporting community-based forest enterprises. This is recognized in Mexico and Namibia, especially, frankly, less so in Guatemala and Nepal, and we can speak to some of those questions subsequently. And so here's our bibliography, and there's a couple of links that you might find useful. First is a guide to investing in collectively held resources, then a video on really speaking especially to the experiences of women and the benefits that have accrued due to rights devolution. So thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Steve. That was very informative, and it was nice to hear kind of like the summary of the implications of body research at the end. And I think I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did. Let me start off with a question that's come in, which was about something you said toward the end of your webinar, which was about the need to have the different parties being aligned.
Yes.
You know, they'd have to know their roles, play their roles
Right.
for community forest management to be successful.
Right.
So there was a two-part question. One is on whether you have some examples of success where that's happened, maybe including your case studies or beyond. And what actually did the different players or the government as a leader perhaps do to, you know, what actions did they take to make sure that it did, the alignment did happen?
Yeah, okay, that's great, thanks. Well, let me offer an example first from outside of the forestry sector. And an analogous experience, though, in fact, in the 1980s, maybe earlier, the government of Philippines decided that they were going to reform the irrigation sector. And the system was, you know, government owned the whole irrigation. And they managed it, including the delivery of water to the farm level, the individual farm level. And so a decision was taken, well, this isn't very efficient. Let's see if we can hand over the rights to managing irrigation water at the local level, at the village level, to the community. And the outcomes might be better because people are there. They know what farms need what water when, and they can sort of police and manage water use in ways that are hopefully more efficient and equitable. So there was a new law promulgated. It gave management rights to villages over water, over irrigation. Law went into effect, but the Ministry of Irrigation continued to act as that. In fact, nothing had changed. And so their local agents, representatives, were trying to manage the water. Okay. And so it was a recognition, and this is really the key point, and we see this especially in the forestry sector, that if you're no longer policing use at the local level, or in the case of forest, you're no longer directly regulating whether or not, you know, what trees can be harvested, okay, or what non-timber forest products can be collected and in what volume, then what is your role? You know, what is your role?
Yeah.
And so it's really about rethinking your role as an institution in light of the fact that so many of the management and regulatory and use decisions are embodied in the rights that have been given to them. So what it is, you know, the agencies haven't got the memo that things have changed.
Right.
And so for a forestry agency, it means moving away from being a fundamentally enforcement agency, one that has an element of it, has some enforcement or regulatory element, but to being supportive, helping with planning, building capacity, developing market relationships. It's a different kind of role. And the challenge, Frank, is that that requires a lot of thinking and investment in its own terms, because staff are not trained to do those kinds of things. And I've argued for some time that donors may be overlooking an important investment opportunity. In the forest agency, in the government sector, because the implications of the rights revolution are quite significant for their roles, their skills, their priorities as well. That's the point I would make. In terms of good examples, I would, I mean, one of the challenges in Nepal now, and I've been there recently, is that the forest agency is no longer regulating and no longer sort of directly regulating, but they're coming up with new kinds of regulations that particularly affect marketing, that have had the effect of stifling enterprise. This is being argued, okay, and that getting your permit, and so on. It's becoming a burdensome, bureaucratic process, and that's problematic. That's seen as problematic by a lot of people working in it. In Mexico, there's a strong experience in the ejidos as effective institutions, a lot of political power in their own right, and they're left pretty much to manage the forest on their own, with very little direct regulation, based on a strong tradition of collective management of forests. So those are a couple of examples. I hope that's responsive.
Yeah. Maybe just a follow-up then,
Yeah.
in terms of the different parties that need to be aligned. And
Yeah.
the tables you had for Guatemala and Nepal, I noted that in the column on private sector, it kind of says limited
Yes.
actions so far.
Yes.
So is that a kind of a fatal flaw, or is it just a kind of it would be better if they could, but they're not, it's not necessary, because you have shown successes even with that limited. So maybe I guess the question is, can you say a few words about the private sector?
Yes.
What would be the most needed types of investments from the private sector, given that you have community forest institutions also?
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, the private sector is interested in the products, obviously, and I think the more successful, or more kind of maybe ones that bear some attention, investments have been actually in Nepal, where you have local businesses, Nepalese businesses, some of which are connected to sort of international markets, that see value in forest-based enterprises, including timber, but mainly non-timber forest products. Charcoal, for instance, is a main product from forest in Nepal. Essential oils, and if you take a look at the video, you'll see an example of a community forest user group where a local businessman who has strong links to sort of international essential oils markets has established a small distillery to distill essential oils from lemongrass. And the photo on our title page of the women, of our PowerPoint today, is of women in Nepal harvesting lemongrass that actually is distilled on site. So that's an example of the supply chain links in Guatemala are quite sophisticated. For instance, the mahogany that's coming in, some part of the mahogany is coming out of the mine biosphere reserve, going into, is being sold to Gibson Guitars in the United States to manufacture the guitar handles, guitars, and they're milled. That product is milled to the sort of basic, shape of the individual guitar handle, by the collectively owned timber mill near Flores. So that's a high value product. So that's an example. One of the bigger challenges is that there's tremendous scope for added investment, but investors are having a hard time finding those companies, or they're not really looking for them. And we see in sort of the global movement around ESG finance, environmental, social, and governance finance, significant amounts of capital are going into various kinds of investment funds. Those monies are going mainly, to sectors where there are pretty sort of strong portals that are sort of able to absorb that funding, like transportation, housing, energy. But the land use sector presents a number of challenges with respect to small scale information, particular kinds of climate risk. So I think venturesome investors have, some real opportunities here, but more effort in sort of making those connections.
So in terms of so different actors are making decisions about whether to invest or not.
Right.
And obviously some economic returns you're showing are a factor for certain investors. How about social returns? You talked about equity, you talked about gender a little bit, about other things. How are those entering the decision-making framework of the different
Yeah. Well, certainly at the community level, it's very, very strong. That if you visit a community forest user group membership meeting or board meeting, local board meeting, you'll see very strong representation from every section of the community. You often see women in leadership. Uh, I really hope that people have a chance to look at the video from Nepal because women themselves are speaking to the dignity of the rights to their personal lives. One woman says, before I had rights, I had nothing. My husband didn't respect me. Now I'm sort of in the world, and able to generate income for the household, and I have a real measure of autonomy. It's really quite striking. And this is what one hopes rights do. So, but the key idea here, once again, is that if it's collective ownership, everyone in the collective has the expectation that they're going to share in the benefits. And so the example of sort of job sharing I offered in one of the concessions I visited in Guatemala is an example of that. This is an enterprise that was processing a non-timber forest product called kadi, which is exported to the United States as something that goes into oral arrangements. So, it's a plant that is for flowers, and it's long-lived. If it's properly managed, it's good for 60 days, for instance. So a lot of that's coming out of in the forest. It's not forest product. But the women, especially, were sharing jobs, and in a way that ensured that everyone who wanted to work had a chance for some cash. So there's at that level is very strong mindfulness of social role of the.
And then just kind of a related question that came in was, so then there are these, you mentioned these, that a lot of the revenue that's generated is used for public goods, education and roads and so forth. But then there's also a need to compensate, I guess, the people who are more involved, right? Who do provide more.
Yeah.
And so are those issues that communities struggle with, or is that something that you find generally they can work out?
No, it's an important question. And we find that in lots of cooperative, this is sort of a challenge for cooperative business models everywhere is that, there may be, the manager of the cooperative would expect to be paid more. And if you're going to get a really talented, skilled co-op manager who's going to, you can rely on, then you're going to need the market for that. Okay. And then you can see resentment among some part of the membership. Well, this is a cooperative and, well, maybe I can do that job better or whatever. So these kinds of tensions are familiar tension. But we find, for instance, I'm just come back to Nepal again because it was one of our, that because of the sort of, it's been historically, a lot of employment has been provided by the forestry sector. And so we see in the community forest use a fair number of retired forestry officials come home. So they're offering their technical skills. They may be on the board, they may be in a leaders. What they can especially do with a local district forestry officer over regulatory issues. That's a vital kind of role that we see, and that's recognized and appreciated. And that person may be not being paid at all. He to have a pension and he's come home after a career in the civil service. And not only in the forestry sector, but in other sectors. That's fairly often, interestingly, another kind of public investment.
Let me try to wind up maybe with two questions. One is that your chart looking at kind of from lower to higher levels of devolution and the differences across the continent. So Africa obviously was to the left. So what's holding Africa back, maybe mostly in terms of the movement towards devolution?
Yeah.
And then related to that, what's the role of research, and where do you see research going to help inform that process?
Yeah. That's a very challenging question and a very important one. And there are different sort of, I think, dimensions in that to this, and that there is such a strong, and this has been across the globe, but during the colonial era, globally, the state assumed ownership, forestry sector, especially for economic revenue purposes. This is revenue for states, many settings, timber, control the timber industry, license for extraction at scale, and also then subsequently for conservation arguments and so on. And so there's a counter movement, that is out there also, that in a global counter movement that raises questions about rights to evolution in relation to climate and biodiversity outcomes. So there's a tension there. And arguably in Africa, the concept that the forest protection element of this argument that really favors state ownership. The traditional part of the estate, the estate belongs to the state, and we can ensure a better outcome. Well, that's one of the arguments in the mix against rights to evolution. And maybe in some other places there's been greater progress in looking and making the case for co-benefits. That we've seen cases, including in the Bataan and the my advisory reserve, where that is a conservation area also. It's surrounded by high levels of protection of these forests, and in fact, there's a coexistence between wildlife populations and sustainable community use. And the wildlife elements are accounted for in the management plan certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. That's one of the kind of criteria. So we can see where joint benefits are possible, and where we see uptake of that ethic, we see greater progress. I think the best example in Africa is Namibia, where communities own the wildlife. And let's be clear here, this is really quite distinct from the typical conservation of wildlife in Africa. So that's something really worth looking at. 20% of the land area of Namibia, a country larger than France, is under the control of community wildlife concessions, and where the environmental outcomes have been tremendous in terms of animal populations and in terms of range of lion range and elephant range and so on. So that's a positive model. But as a generalization, another factor in Africa is the generally positive thing, which is the persistence of customary tenure. So I think something that's not being captured here in these data is the extent to which people honor customary tenure. There's not a lot of demand for title, as is the case in Latin America. So these forests are typically titled, collective titles, because title is the way you secure rights in Latin America. It's sort of the name of the game. And people know and understand that the system honors title. And that's not the case in most of Africa. Most agricultural land, most pasture lands and so on are held under customary arrangements. So title isn't seen as the answer. Clear recognition statutorily of the rights associated with customary tenure, something that we see people getting emphasis to, and we see that recognized in recent constitutional reforms, including in Kenya, the statutory recognition of tribal land or customary land. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more inclusion of forests. For instance, Ethiopia last year promulgated the 2018 Forest Proclamation that would give rights to communities to their forests. And it's been a very successful experience. And Pim has worked a lot on this, on recognizing, certifying agricultural land rights at the farm level in a cost-effective way. It's had very positive outcomes. Well, that sort of model is being picked up and applied in the forestry sector. So there is promise for greater, but there's less commitment today, certainly in the level of the forestry agencies, which are vital. to effective land devolution in Africa.
Oh, great. I think we've come to the end of our time. So I'll wrap this up. I want to just say a couple of things is that for those of us in the CGIAR, we have some targets that we're trying to achieve, amongst them reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce deforestation, and restore degraded land. And if you think about all of those, you realize the topic of today is vitally important for us reaching any of those targets. It's not a technological fix as much as it is an institutional fix. And so I think the topic is today was very important, and the theme of governance and natural resources, it's something that's not going to go away from the CG. And so we're thrilled to have had this presentation, and thank you very much, Steve, for your insights.
Thanks. Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everyone.